to the latest in the war, and the first batch of M2 Bradley combat vehicles have left the U.S. for Ukraine. The U.S. military announcing the shipment last night. It includes more than 60 Bradleys. Now, officials say they'll provide Ukrainian forces, quote, additional offensive and defensive capabilities to protect their borders against Russia's illegal invasion. All right, let's get you out to the ground to see what is happening in the war. Day 342, Jim Lechner live in Kyiv this evening. Jim?
Well, good evening, Bianca. As you can see, we're coming to you from harsh winter conditions here in Kyiv. Those conditions are even tougher up at the front in the Donbass salient, where the Russians continue to put immense pressure on the Ukrainian lines focused on the siege of Bakhmut. Now, that situation has created an immense pressure for the equipment, the tanks, the Bradleys that you mentioned, and now fighter planes and long-range missiles for the HIMARS systems and other systems. There's two factors that are mainly driving these urgent calls for these systems, and that is the fact that the siege in Bakhmut is pulling in some of the best units in the Ukrainian army, and inevitably they're getting chewed up in the difficult fighting there as they're outmanned and outgunned by the Russians, especially in artillery. The second thing that's hanging over these battles like an axe is the fact the Russians have 200,000 troops that are ready to commit to the fighting in a new offensive. That's the size of the force they initially invaded Ukraine with. That's a significant factor the Ukrainians and everyone else is aware of. This has made it a race against time for the Russians to begin that offensive and for the equipment to arrive from the West. And it's not just about the equipment. The Ukrainians have to be trained as crewmen. They've got to be trained as teams and to work together in order for that equipment to work. And so it's a race against time for the Russian offensive and for these new units to be equipped and get into the line to meet that offensive. Back to you.
Jim Lechner live for us this evening in Kyiv. Jim, appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, let's get some more insight on this from retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. Tony, great to have you with us.
Hey, John, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, we see the escalation. We see these constant attacks by the Russians. We talked yesterday about a missile attack on a hospital, on a school, on an apartment building. And this is what you anticipated happening, that Vladimir Putin would start to tighten the screws on Ukrainian civilians. We also saw the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg of NATO yesterday saying that China is watching this unfold in Ukraine. Take a listen.
If President Putin wins in Ukraine, this would send a message that authoritarian regimes can achieve their goals through brute force. This is dangerous. Beijing is watching closely and learning lessons that may influence its future decisions. What is happening in Europe today could happen in East Asia tomorrow.
Now, Tony, we've been talking about this, and we know China's watching this very closely, but we see this incremental increase. There's talk of bringing tanks, but then you got to wait for the Germans to come around on the idea. There was talk last year of supplying planes, and then everyone got cold feet about that. And what you see is Vladimir Putin kind of biding his time, waiting for opportunities. And your point is that this starts to resemble what Lyndon Johnson was doing in Vietnam in the late 1960s, is just incremental changes, never really doing enough to end it, never really getting serious about peace talks, but thinking you can win. Tell us about that perspective.
So, yeah, it's like the NATO president watched our video from a year ago, recognizing that China is watching and what we do matters regarding strategy. And that's what's lacking, strategy. I actually spoke with members of the Reagan administration and talked to one of them who was actually involved in strategy, John. And the point was, when they were presented with the Russian challenge, not only did they work together to establish a strategy to stay ahead of it, everything that Biden doing is reaction. He reacts to the Germans. He reacts to inputs. There's no over the horizon. Let's see how we can get ahead of this, which brings me to my point regarding LBJ. Lyndon Baines Johnson inherited the Vietnam conflict, and instead of doing a very deep review of how to win, he basically said, well, let's just do a few things here and there to get ahead of it. One of the things they did, it's deja vu all over again, John, the Biden folks taking the worst lessons of history, wanting to actually up-arm the Vietnamese to win against the North Vietnamese, but not wanting to introduce American troops because obviously we'd get into it. We're at that very point right now where we've done a lot to give them weapons, try to encourage them, but there's no understanding of how to achieve victory or how to help them achieve victory. And all we're doing, I mean, please, 31 tanks, you couldn't defend Toledo, Ohio with 31 tanks, let alone 3 Russian armies are getting ready to come over the horizon.
This is not a repeat of the Cold War. We are in a hot war. You listen to the way Vladimir Putin characterizes this war. He's attacking Ukraine, but he's talking about a war on the West and specifically on the United States. And he is using those apartment buildings and those hospitals and the schools in Ukraine to make a point to us, knowing, you talked about Ronald Reagan. He was not scared to push back against the Soviets like President Ford was before him and Carter before and after that. They seem to be scared. It sounds a lot like a Biden minute. Well, if we do this, then they're going to start using nuclear weapons. The only thing they seem to understand is force, the Russians.
They do, and this is the thing that was the beauty of Reagan. Reagan understood the idea that we must engage, we must negotiate, but you must do it, John, from a position of authority and strength. That's why Putin didn't do this under Trump. Trump made it very clear that Trump, would hold Putin personally responsible for any sort of aggression. And this is what's lacking now. And the other thing, too, your audience has seen us talk about this for almost 2 years now. But we have seen Biden do things 6 months late that had he done it 6 months earlier may have had a deterrent effect. So they're always reacting. They're always behind the curve. And now they're reacting to European leaders. Basically, this flip-flop on the tanks is huge. No, we're not sending tanks. Oh, no, I changed my mind. Now we are. It constantly shows weakness. And whenever you demonstrate weakness, you're not in a position to negotiate. And, John, Putin reads this as the green light to continue aggression and even be more aggressive if you can't get your act together. And that's what's going on.
And the only reason why he hasn't really done more is because he's trying to maintain some legitimacy on the world stage. He knows if he pushes too hard, China will not have a choice. But that's the fine line he's walking. But yet the Biden administration seems unwilling to try and leverage that.
Dangerous times.
Great insight, as always.
It is
Lieutenant
very
Colonel
dangerous.
Tony Shaffer, we appreciate it.
Thanks, John.